Today we present the first episode of a three-part series dedicated to a topic that always fascinates us: the Knights Templar, the warrior monks, born in the Holy Land the day after the First Crusade and annihilated 2 centuries later by Philip IV of France in a famous and terrible political trial. As you can well imagine, we have received a lot of questions and curiosities about this topic. I would like to start by answering Augusto's question, which I will summarize here. It is a very detailed question, but essentially, Augusto emphasizes that it is a paradox of monks, of Christian religious who, however, have the mission to fight and therefore to kill. How was this possible, says Augusto? He articulated this very well. How was the paradox of the killer monk possible? Here, Augusto, it was possible because the era of the Crusades experienced a profound transformation in the mentality of the Christian world, particularly regarding the relationship with war. Christianity had long remained true to its origins, condemning war. Throughout the High Middle Ages, during the entire Roman barbarian era, which had known rulers like Charlemagne, engaged in wars in defense of the faith, or at least presented by propaganda as wars for the Christian faith. However, throughout this time, the Christian clergy remained faithful to the idea that war is, in any case, a terrible thing, and that those who kill in war must do penance, even if it is a just war. No one would have ever spoken of holy war, and then around the year 1000, things change. The decisive change will occur with the First Crusade, but in reality, things begin even earlier, as the 11th century is the century in which the Reconquista begins, when the Christian princes of Spain start to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula occupied by the Arabs centuries before. Therefore, there is an open front of struggle against the infidels. And in the collective mentality of Christians, the idea begins to penetrate that we, the Christians, have enemies, permanent enemies who are our enemies and enemies of God. And it is our destiny to fight against them. Here, it is on the Spanish front that the idea begins to spread that there can be a war that is not only just, but also holy, that fighting in that war is noble, and that those who die in that war are martyrs. But the martyrs who fall fighting against the infidels are asked to take as many of those enemies of God with them to the other world as possible. It is the ideology that inspires a work like the Song of Roland, the first great chanson de geste, written even before the First Crusade, in which Roland, when facing the enemy at Roncevaux, tells his cape, "Men, here we shall suffer martyrdom. Strike lords with shining swords," which means you are a martyr if you die, but you are also a martyr if you kill, because martyr means witness of the faith, and the Christian knight bears witness to his faith with sword in hand. At this point, we can understand how it was possible that, on the eve of the First Crusade, a group of knights who were volunteering in the Holy Land decided to volunteer, not by assisting pilgrims or the sick, but in the most effective way, by doing what they knew best: fighting. They feel it as a vow. They want to dedicate their lives to fighting for the Holy Land, and therefore ask to be recognized as a religious order. And there, it is discovered that not everyone has yet fallen victim to this new idea, that in certain cases fighting and killing is good. There are some resistances. The idea of creating an order of Christian monks whose mission is to fight and kill, to be killers, as Augustus said, this idea still shocks many. Until a heavyweight enters the scene, one of the great intellectuals of that time, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, comes into play, who is in favor and publishes a treatise, The Praise of the New Chivalry. It states that the violence of the knights was a bad thing, as long as it caused disorder, suffering, and death, here in the Christian world. But now that the Templars want to direct it against the enemies of God, they must be supported in every way, because the Templar is indeed a witness of faith, a martyr. And as St. Bernard says, he kills serenely and dies serenely. As you can see, despite the resistances, Christianity at that moment is completely overwhelmed by the idea that the true mission of the Christian world is to oppose the Muslim world by all means. And in this struggle against the Muslims, the Templars will be one of the great protagonists. In this episode, we will see how the Order of the Temple, in addition to fighting in the Holy Land to defend the territories conquered by Christians during the First Crusade, becomes something more. Because in reality, the idea of the Order of the Temple is very appealing. In other words, it is in line with the spirit of the times. And the Christians are happy to help these men who have vowed to sacrifice their lives, to defend Jerusalem. Helping them means giving generously. And so the Order of the Temple becomes a large international organization that received possessions, lands, and enterprises, we would say today, throughout all of Christian Europe. It will end up that most of the Knights Templar, instead of fighting in the Holy Land, are engaged in Europe, managing the vast wealth they have accumulated. Questions that we have received about the Templars are many, as you know, and I will never answer all of them, but I will answer some. And I would like to start with a very interesting question from Francesco, who asks how the Templars were perceived by their enemies, namely the Muslims. And it is a question that actually lends itself to an answer that is, shall we say, not entirely simple. I mean that the image of the Templars, as it emerges from the testimonies of the Muslims, Turks, and Arabs against whom they fought, is a very multifaceted image. On one hand, there is no doubt that they were feared, and being feared, they were also hated. The Templars were one of the fundamental components of the army of the King of Jerusalem. At certain moments, they were considered extremists, and therefore more dangerous enemies than others. The most significant moment is after the Great Battle of Hattin in 1187, in which Saladin defeats the army of the King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, capturing the king and much of his knights. Afterward, Saladin, who has gone down in history since the Middle Ages, was admired as a heroic and chivalrous opponent. Saladin negotiates with the Christian king who is a prisoner and ultimately agrees to free him, along with most of the prisoners, but not the Templars, whom he has executed. In that case, there is evidently the idea of facing particularly entrenched enemies. However, this is just one point of view, because we also have, for example, an extraordinary memoir, the memoir of an Arab prince, the Emir of Shadzar, named Usama ibn Munkir, who some time before, in the early decades of the 12th century, spent his life partly fighting against the Franks, as they called them, who had invaded the Holy Land, and partly during times of truce negotiating with them, discussing with them, and getting to know them. Here, Usama, who often found himself, for example, visiting Jerusalem in the hands of the Crusaders during periods of peace and truce to negotiate, to do business, and so on, states that among all these barbaric infidels who have invaded the Holy Land, the least bad are actually the Templars, because the Templars live there. Most of the Crusaders that Usama deals with are people who have just arrived from Europe, just disembarked, and therefore they are crude, intolerant, and do not understand anything. The Templars understand. They are used to being there. They know that there are periods of war, but also periods of truce. They know that they must coexist in a certain sense. There is an episode, for example, where he is in Jerusalem, and they let him go pray at the former great mosque that the Templars have taken possession of. The Templars allow him to perform his Muslim prayer there, and Usama recounts that there is another crusader, one who has just arrived, one of those who understands nothing, who sees him praying there, and is not happy with the direction in which he prays, because he prays towards Mecca, and he tries to force him to move. Usama says that until my Templar friends arrived and chased him away, they told me, sorry, be patient, because he is just a newcomer. He has never seen anyone pray like you do. So, in short, the image of the Templars was a complex, layered image, even beyond those activities, so to speak, of great financiers and bankers, regarding which we have also received questions, like the one from Antonella, who asks in the end where the business of the Crusade was, or the one from Gustavo, who asks if the Templars were the forerunners of modern banking. In reality, there was a business in the Crusade. It existed for the businessmen, for the Italian merchants, the Pisans, the Genoese, the Venetians, for their fleets of war galleys and cargo ships that were essential for maintaining connections between overseas, as they called it, and the Holy Land. That was where the business was. That was where the money was. The Templars found themselves in it without wanting to. They were still people who took a vow to be killed fighting against the infidels. However, donations were coming in. The treasures accumulated in the coffers were growing. European kings summoned the Templars and asked if they had someone experienced in handling money to appoint as treasurer, and in this way, the Templars found themselves, so to speak, involved in the business of the Crusades, as Antonella says. In the long run, this will cost them dearly, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We are not there yet. An episode that inevitably recounts the catastrophe with which the history of the order came to an end. The great trial initiated by the King of France, Philip the Fair, does something quite extraordinary, I must say, for those times, and which would be extraordinary perhaps even in our times. That is, he manages to have all the Templars in their locations arrested on the same day throughout the Kingdom of France, without anyone suspecting what is about to happen. There is also a process that lasts for years and is still controversial, in which the Templars confess to everything: heresy, satanic rites, renunciation of Jesus Christ, spitting on the cross, sodomy, and there is still debate about whether there could be any truth in this degeneration of the order, or if it is instead a Stalinist-type process, where all the accusations were invented by the Inquisitor. The catastrophe of the Templars has greatly astonished our viewers. It writes in a line how it was possible to suppress them if they were so rich, powerful, and international. Daniela writes, because no one defended them from the attacks of a destitute king who exterminated them solely to seize their wealth. So in reality, the story of the trial of the Templars is one of the murkiest and most complicated events of the early 14th century. But we cannot reduce everything simply to the greed for wealth of a king who decides to destroy this order that is too rich in order to seize its money. In reality, it is not so. There is something more. Let us remember the context. Christian Europe emerges from centuries during which the popes have seriously asserted their supremacy. For over 2 centuries, the popes claimed to be the political leaders of the Christian world, superior to the emperor, superior to kings. Now the time has come when the most powerful kings of Europe no longer accept this balance of power. And the most powerful of all the kings of Europe is the King of France, Philip the Fair, a sinister character, I must say. Sinister and fascinating. A king who greatly strengthens his power, even through political trials and witchcraft trials, which is the great novelty of that era. That is the era when even the intellectuals and politicians of the Christian world begin to truly believe that there are witches, that there are people who make a pact with the devil, and the Inquisition must seek them out. With Philip the Fair being a master in using witchcraft trials to destroy his opponents, one of his opponents was Pope Boniface VIII, whom Philip the Fair had arrested in his palace in Anagni and slapped. Boniface then died of rage shortly after that. Thus, Philip the Fair is engaged in a power struggle with the papacy, in which essentially the King of France and the intellectuals and propagandists at his service do not hesitate to declare that in France, the true Pope is the King, that the clergy must obey the King, not the Pope of Rome, and that before the clergy existed, the King of France was the master of his kingdom. This is the climate of political discourse. At the moment when Boniface VIII's successor, Pope Clement Phocas, must somehow seek to make peace with the King of France. Keep in mind that France is not only the most powerful kingdom in Europe, but it is also the ancient ally of the Church of Rome. One cannot be without the relationship with the King of France. It's no coincidence that Clement Phocas, at a certain point, moved to France, to Avignon. You are aware of the Avignon captivity. It is important to reconnect with the King of France, because he is in a position of strength at that moment and wants to make that clear. The trial of the Templars perhaps arises primarily from this: Philip the Fair wants to show Pope Clement that he is the one in command, that he, the King of France, can directly attack a large religious organization, a significant organization, protected and directed by the Pope, and can destroy it and force the Pope to follow him. And that is what happens. The process is entirely managed by the French monarchy, and Pope Clement the Fair, caught completely by surprise, does what he can to save the Templars, but is unsuccessful. So essentially, the trial of the Templars is evidence that long before the discussion of absolute statehood, the ability of the popes to impose their will on kings had come to an end.